Hey guys, so I get a fair amount of questions pertaining to using Spektrum gear, and I want to do more for that. So I'm going to be doing a few episodes on this channel around Spektrum stuff. We're going to start with the basics. How to bind your Spektrum receiver to your mini quad. This is just the most basic thing that we can cover. So what I've got here is a new Spektrum 4649T receiver. This is the diversity receiver with telemetry that I like to use, and I've just got a leftover flight board here. So there's a couple of ways to bind Spektrum. You can either trigger bind mode on your receiver using your flight board. I know it works really well in race flight, but beta flight has been problematic. Or you can use a bind plug. So this is the harness that comes with this receiver. So what you would do is cut off this male servo end and solder it to your flight board. You've got your red for 5 volts, your black for ground, and your blue for signal. And this little dangly female servo connector is where you could put in a bind plug. Got one here. So then what you would do is put your bind plug in, and then when you power up your flight board, your receiver will go into bind mode. However, if you're like me, you don't want to be carrying around this extra connector that you're going to use very infrequently. So when I hook up my harness to my flight board, I cut it pretty short. This is the end that goes into my receiver, and then I solder it to the flight board. So hold on, let me do that real quick. So we've got the black connected to ground, the red connected to 5 volts, and the blue signal wire connected to the receiver of one of the flight board's UARTs. So now once you have it hooked up like this, you don't have access to the place to plug in your bind plug. So unless you've already bound your receiver, which, you know, that's a good way to do it too, bind it before even hooking it up, now you need to figure out how to do that. Like I said, it is possible to get the receiver to go into bind mode using your flight board and the configurator on your computer, and we'll come back to that, but that doesn't always work. Particularly with beta flight, that function has been buggy for quite some time, depending on the flight board you're using or the firmware version. It doesn't always work reliably. So before we try to do that, let me just show you the really simple way to bypass all of that is to essentially emulate the function of a bind plug. What a bind plug does is it connects the ground wire to the signal wire. So if we are not able to get the receiver to go into bind mode using software, we're just gonna take the signal wire off the signal pad and move it over to a ground. So now I've jumped the signal wire to the ground pad. It doesn't even have to be a really good solder joint because it's only going to be temporary. We just get it hooked up like this, and then when we plug in our battery, we're in bind mode as indicated by a rapidly blinking light. So you get it in bind mode, you do your binding thing, and then you move the receiver wire back to where it needs to be. Alright, we've got the blue signal wire moved back to where it needs to be to actually send the signal to your flight board. And now when we plug in our battery, the receiver does not go into bind mode. So simply hooking the signal wire up to a ground, I think, is the easiest and most straightforward way that you're guaranteed to be able to get your receiver into bind mode. So now what I want to cover is binding using your firmware. So I showed you how to do it just by jumping the signal wire to ground, and that's kind of like it's kind of just like a physical way to ensure that it gets done. But if you want to try and do it through software, it should be possible. Now I have flashed onto this board a pre-release version of Betaflight 3.3, and I know that it works with this version. But you never know when the final version of 3.3 comes out, maybe it'll be broken again, but fingers crossed. So, plugging it into my computer, and we are in the Betaflight configurator, hit connect, and we're gonna go straight into the CLI area. So this isn't a feature that they've given us like a button to just click on. Raceflight did that, it's really nice, but in Betaflight, you still have to do a command code. So to see our Spektrum related codes, we're just going to type get Spektrum. And the one that we want is Spektrum sat bind. Currently it is 0. what we want to set it to is 9, which is what will go into bind mode for a DSMX receiver, and that's the protocol that you should be using. I believe if you are using a DSM2 receiver, then you want to set it to 7, but you should really be using DSMX. So now we are just going to type set spectrum underscore set underscore bind equals 9. So as long as spectrum sat bind is set to 9, whenever you plug in the flight board, the receiver is going to go into bind mode for DSMX protocol. You'll see that the other spectrum command is spectrum sat bind auto reset, and it's currently set to on. And what that does is it sets the spectrum sat bind line back to 0 after 1 power cycle. So we're going to leave it on, and if this is working properly, and again it's been a long time since this has worked properly in beta flight, we're going to plug in the board, it's going to go into bind mode, we're going to bind it, we are then going to take power away from the board. This should trigger the auto reset, which will set that bind term back to 0. So anyways, we're going to type save and unplug the board from USB. I'm creating a whole new model, so I don't want to mess up anything I've got going on here. And I want to show you something else really quick. So before you bind in Spectrum, this is something I didn't know for a while, focus. What you want to do is go down to frame rate, go in there. The default is 22 milliseconds. Select that, click it. Now it's 11 milliseconds. That will ensure that you have the lowest latency. So now your latency should be 11 milliseconds instead of 22 milliseconds. I didn't know that for a long time. And since the default is 22, because non-digital servos can't handle that, a lot of people don't even get the quickest response time out of their Spectrum radio that they can. So anyways, with that done, we're gonna take our flight board, plug in our battery. If it's working. Oh, you son of a... It didn't work! Are you kidding me? This is what I'm talking about. It doesn't... We're gonna try that again. The bind term went back to 0. We're gonna try it one more time. Set spectrum set square bind equals 9. Save. Now we're gonna plug it in again. This time it worked. We have bind mode. Set that down. Grab this. Get separation.
Binding. DSMX 11 milliseconds. Telemetry.
And we are all bound.
Complete.
The reason I held it further away is to get separation, because if you are too close to the receiver, you can crowd it with RF, and sometimes binding fails. So just like, you know, get some distance. But anyways, the receiver is now bound, is indicated by a solid orange light, and what I'm going to try next is plugging it back in to see if the auto reset term did its job and set the bind term back to 0. Plug it in. And we have solid. So that is how it should work. It may not work for you. Like I've said a few times now, that function has been really problematic in Betaflight for a long time. So if all else fails, just jump the wire like I showed you. I kind of wish Spectrum would just put like a bind button on their receiver, because if you think about it, all they have to do is put a momentary button that connects the ground circuit to the signal circuit, and then, you know, we wouldn't have to worry with any of this stuff. But for now they don't. So that's what it is. Hope this helped, and we'll do more Spectrum related things. Leave a comment with other Spectrum questions you might have, and I'll do my best to get to them. Thanks for checking out this channel. Hit that subscribe button, and I will see you next time.